short talk.
are good and so on.
Okay, thank you.
But I actually heard something very
Oh.
different. I heard a lot of concern about what China was
So
doing.
we have to do everything by ourselves.
Everybody I talked to in Self-Defense Force and the Diet in Gaima show, it would always end with, "We hope you Americans will do something about it." And it strikes me that that's changed now under Abe. You know, now there's a much more active Japanese effort, you know, to counter China, which was not there, you know, a decade ago.
Yeah, yeah. But still, I think the Japanese government wants the United States to be there, but just in case.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sorry, I should introduce
yeah.
myself.
Yes. Thank you very much for joining today.
More than odd.
Still, I used to be here.
Did you?
Yeah,
When
yeah.
was that?
2011 to 12.
2011, 12?
Yeah, it's as a Japan scholar here.
And then I joined in 2011, so
So must be.
we will overlap very slightly. But that's
Thank you very much.
That's a little out of date, but
Okay.
I'm trying to remember the name of there was a Japanese journalist who was here.
Oh, yes, from Indonesia.
No, not from Indonesia,
No?
from Japan.
I mean, he used to be head of the Asahi
Oh, that could be.
Jakarta branch.
Yeah, that could be.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
started with, his name started with an N, like Nomura or.
Yes, I should remember him. Yeah,
Yeah.
we are
Okay,
overlapping.
well,
Yes,
you
yes.
must have.
Yes. After him, I was appointed to Japan scholar here.
Okay.
And I'm currently staying in Singapore and on sabbatical. I used to
Okay.
teach at the NUS, so I just went back to my old employer at the moment.
I see. Okay, so we're.
We're ready to
Oh.
start. Can you,
Hi.
would you be able to
Oh, yes,
pass,
yes,
your
yes,
way.
yes.
pass
Thank you.
water? Okay, great.
Uh,
Well, thank you all for
it's
coming.
all-
I think
it's
we're
yours.
okay.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Going to start once our speakers have a seat. If that door could be closed, I think that would be helpful. Thank you. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Shihoko Goto with the Wilson Center's Asia program. Oh, is it on?
I don't know.
I don't know. I think it's on. This event is actually being live recorded, so I believe the microphones are on. We're really excited to be hosting this event together with USJI, which represents some of Japan's top universities. And they actually showcase some of the top research that Japanese universities do, as diverse as molecular biology to innovation challenges to US-Japan security relations. And we are absolutely honored and delighted to be partnering with them this year again, too. And I want to thank Professor Takashi Terada in particular for making sure that this partnership between USJI and the Wilson Center continues. And I also want to extend my thanks to Go Kobayashi, who is the USJI rep here in Washington. The timing of this event really couldn't be at a better time. The media coverage, certainly, of Obama's visit to the Asia-Pacific region has been extensive, and it's been dubbed Obama's farewell tour to Asia. There's been much discussion about Obama's legacy to Asia, and there's been renewed vigor of the White House towards Southeast Asia in particular. But the question is, what about ASEAN itself? There's a lot of talk about ASEAN centrality, and Japan certainly has embraced that. Japanese Prime Minister Abe has made a point of visiting all 10 of ASEAN countries within a year of taking office before he visited China or South Korea. But at the same time, ASEAN is a grouping of countries with a very diverse economic as well as political background. And they could actually be further divided between those who are part of the TPP and those who are not. We have a really great lineup today to discuss many of those issues and deal with others as well. You have their bios in front of you, but from my left is Takashi Terada, who is a former Wilson Center Japan scholar and now professor at Doshisha University. Next to him is Mark Mannion, who is a specialist in Asian affairs at the US Congressional Research Service. And he actually has to leave immediately after this to write extensively about North Korea for members of Congress. So we're very lucky that he could join us today. Next to him is Rumi Aoyama, who is a professor at Waseda University's Research Institute of Current Chinese Affairs, and she's actually a visiting scholar at George Washington University for the next 6 months. And finally, but certainly not least, is Marvin Ott, who is he has many, many hats. He is a senior scholar at the Wilson Center, and he also is a lecturer at SAIS. He also teaches at the National War College. So I'm going to ask Takashi to get us started, perhaps to really explain our title. What is great power competition, and what role does Japan play, if any, in that?
Thank you very much, Shohoku-san. Very good morning. Thank you very much for gathering. Well, before starting something a bit serious, let me say a few words on behalf of USGI, for which I'm serving as an operating advisor. Again, since I think 2013, partly because I used to be staying here at Wilson Center and also involving in the USGI week twice in a year, actually, in September and February. Thanks to the Wilson Center, the Asian programs, and also Shohoku-san's great help. My panel, well, Doshisha University's panel on the USGI week, has been privileged to organize a joint seminar, as we have now here today. And February this year, we had one focusing on development issues like AIIB. Even before, we have a TPP or other regional organizations. But today, we decided to focus on ASEAN. Of course, timing, as Shohoku mentioned. We just completed a series of ASEAN-led summit meetings. The very last one was the East Asian Summit, in which President Obama participated officially. And the US actually joined officially EAS 2011. But before that, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton also participated as an observer. And of course, America's commitment to East Asian Summit, with the Japanese government long waited since 2005 when East Asian Summit was organized first time, indicated, of course, America's serious commitment to the Asia-Pacific region when named Asia Pivot or rebalancing strategy, something like that. But second, of course, America's interest in Asia-Pacific region have a variety of reasons, economically and also strategically. But in terms of sort of the institutions which tried to control dialogues or setting up some of the arrangements for political, economic, and strategic issues, well, ASEAN tended to be located at the hub or center of the institutional arrangements. Of course, my own proposition for that is quite, the doubtful on the ASEAN capability, which I try to explain later on. But through this seminar, particularly personally, I want to gather there's quite different perspectives. For example, American or Chinese, or more generally, the more international community's perspectives on ASEAN, etc. Well, again, I'm introduced as a professor at Doshisha, one of the 9 member universities at the USGI. I'm currently staying in Singapore on sabbatical, so that's why I needed 22 hours to come down here for this event. Already I started Well, yeah, jet lag, but the topic was so much exciting that I'm sure I could survive until the end of this session. Okay. The topic already disappeared. Well, we try to focus on China-US, sort of the competitions, and focusing on Asia-Pacific region. Of course, there's a number of issues, and both superpowers disagree. And but in my cases, I would like to pick up two issues: security and also economy, particularly regional integration. This is my own field of research over the last 2 decades. Even when I was here at Wilson Center, we worked together with my former colleagues here at Center on TPP and US-Japan relationships at that time. And well, again, this week's ASEAN-centered summit purely focused on how the China's behaviors in the South China Sea could be, in a sense, controlled. But of course, as expected by many ASEAN institutions, even East Asian Summit with Japanese Prime Minister, American President participation, we could not do something for controlling China's behaviors. And again, it seems, again, my former colleague at Waseda will try to explain more in more details, but China's sometimes strategically use its economic strengths in Southeast Asia to achieve its strategic objectives. And this is something which probably United States and Japan or other some of the Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam or Philippines, who also claim some area of the South China Sea, find it quite difficult to use ASEAN to put the pressure on China to change Chinese behavior to their favor. So again, it seems to me Japanese, Americans, Philippines, even Vietnamese approaches to China on South China Sea, but can be depicted as struggling, particularly because of the nature of ASEAN. So interesting problems. Again, probably I can use this PowerPoint page even when I make a same kind of presentation 10 years ago. Of course, at that time, South China Sea was not necessarily considered to be a serious problem. It seems it was 2010 when US found the Chinese approaches to South China Sea, calling the area critical interest of China. Even the Chinese vessels tried to prevent the American ships, like named Impeccable, and South China Sea, operating together with the Vietnamese and to explore some of the natural resources like oil at that time. But since then, the American serious commitment to ASEAN started, particularly after signing the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. But it's called ASEAN's constitution, which includes so-called non-intervention principle. Japanese, Australians, even United States were quite hesitant to sign it because of this non-intervention principle. But of course, it doesn't have so much impact on those external larger countries' foreign policy and by exchanging side letters. But anyway, thanks to that, US was able to officially joining East Asian Summit, as I mentioned. Well, a couple of the characteristics I can probably highlight it in terms of the ASEAN's management of regional institutions or dialogues. Number one, talk shop. This was, as far as I remember, mentioned by Hillary Clinton when she made a speech in Vietnam in 2010, and also her article appeared in Foreign Policy following year. And simply, the ASEAN was responsible for organizing meetings for foreign ministers, trade ministers, even heads of governments. So therefore, President Obama needed to come to Southeast Asia to attend this type of meetings once in a year. And ASEAN-related summit, like East Asian Summit, has never been organized outside Southeast Asia, therefore. That's why many people believe, the ASEAN has responsibility. But, this, the attitude also confuses some of the terminologies like ASEAN centrality. What does it mean? ASEAN actually has playing a central role for controlling, governing some of the issues related to Asia-Pacific beyond Southeast Asia. Of course, ASEAN is an institution for Southeast Asian affairs. It's no doubt. But the question is, participation by external countries, the United States, China, Japan, Australia, South Korea, even European Unions. And ASEAN can control some of the institutions in which they officially join. But recently, ASEAN tried to change the connotations of ASEAN centrality, which means to them, ASEAN should be central to their foreign policy. But of course, I myself also cast a doubt on that. As I described in number 3 here, it's, in my view, it's rhetoric. So talk shop, ASEAN way, this is the second point. Again, this is very significant. Consensus-based decision-making, non-binding, and non-interference principles. So once even one nation disagree, ASEAN couldn't launch as its own position on certain issues, for example, South China Sea. In 2012, ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting chaired by Cambodia, which had a strong, the economic linkages with China, not only through trade, but also aid. Even Cambodia didn't conceal its own positions not to do harm China's national interest. So South China Sea simply tried to include the problem of South China Sea into the joint communique. But as a chair, Cambodia didn't do it. And Vietnam, Philippines strongly opposed to it. The first time in history, ASEAN was formed in 1965, so next year is the 50th anniversary. First time in history, foreign ministers meeting failed to launch the joint communique. So chair was quite significant in a sense. It's rotated. So Laos, at the moment, is the ASEAN chair, which should be finishing soon, replaced by the Philippines. So Philippines will be the chairing ASEAN meetings until next September. But of course, Philippines' position on the South China Sea is changing, particularly after the new president came in. So that's a probably bit source of the headache for the U.S. Government. But again, U.S. also will have a new president. So how both new president coordinate the different propositions, widening, growing different propositions South China Sea at the moment. Okay, so 3 major characteristics which are highlighted in terms of the ASEAN's governance. In my view, is source of the problems. Again, Hillary Clinton announcement to the Asian pivot actually said ASEAN should be more result-oriented institutions. Why she needed to highlight result-oriented institution? If it were result-oriented institution, of course she wouldn't need to have said so. So American government didn't believe ASEAN was a result-oriented at that time. That's why I urged the need of ASEAN to change its propositions on some of the approaches as highlighted here. So question is, ASEAN actually has been changed into a result-oriented institution as Hillary Clinton requested 5-6 years ago? And my answer is no, as I already hinted at. So this is just describing the who actually tried to support China's views among Southeast Asian nations. Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia were 4 claimants on South China Sea. So they tend to be, of course, at some loggerheads with China, particularly Vietnam recently and the Philippines in the previous government. Myanmar, Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore were considered to be neutral. But this year, Singapore, Indonesia took a bit harsher positions on South China Sea. Particularly Indonesian president, even Indonesian minister in charge of the ocean and maritime development, didn't hesitate to sink the so-called illegal shipments into the Indonesia's exclusive economic zones. Most of them, yes, Chinese. So more than, I heard 200 ships, Chinese ships already sank by Indonesia because they came to the territory of Indonesia. Of course, that's not considered to be South China Sea. So it's nothing to do with the South China Sea dispute. But nevertheless, China's expansion to the territory of Indonesia, it started annoying it and taking a bit, the harsher positions. And interestingly, Indonesia's position to harsher approaches to China on South China Sea considered to be considering ASEAN unity, because many people in Southeast Asia, even Singapore, which I'm currently staying, try to read some of the local newspapers like Jakarta Post, Bangkok. Some commentators started quite overtly criticizing the ASEAN, or maybe crisis. China news agents, ASEAN foreign ministers meeting in July called ASEAN unity is in crisis, and urging the ASEAN people to consider the ASEAN more seriously. But however, if stronger nation like Indonesia cannot take any leadership positions, ASEAN couldn't be moving. So Indonesia finally took an approach towards strengthening ASEAN unity. So in order to do that, Indonesia just started saying something to China and Singapore too. But Cambodia, Laos, who heavily relied on China's economic aid, cannot follow it. As I mentioned, it's a consensus-based decision-making system in ASEAN. One nation's opposition could be easily destroying any sort of agendas. So once disputed, ASEAN member states find it a certain agenda problematic, they try to shelve it. And that's it, not following it, until a certain nation tries to bring it back to the ASEAN negotiations. So this is sort of the system which ASEAN member states try to observe over the last 4 or 5 decades. And this was understandable, because most of the nations, except for Thailand, were colonized by imperial powers, became independent in the 1950s and 60s. So they are quite busy for nation buildings, not be quite happy with the intervention by even neighboring countries. But they formed ASEAN, not only because for creating the one voice against China or Vietnam, particularly the Vietnam War was at that time there. But most significant element in terms of non-intervention principle ASEAN employed was to ask regional countries, its neighboring countries, not to touch on domestic affairs, to purely focus on the nation buildings. So human rights, race-oriented issues, it's sort of taboo in ASEAN. I remember in mid-2000, southern part of Thailand, they had sort of the riots because that's Muslims. Of course, Thai is a Buddhist country, and the Thaksin tried to take quite radical actions to control the southern part of Thailand's action, and creating quite a few casualties. But Thaksin said, if Indonesia, Malaysia, two big Islamic countries, try to deal with this issue in ASEAN summits, I wouldn't join it, because this is against the no-intervention principle. So even the word advice It's sort of the something which most of the ASEAN nations became hesitant to use, considered to be intervention. So Cambodia, Laos, just working as a proxy, in a sense, for China's interest. This is just highlighting the so-called the code of conduct, which now they are highlighted as a major agenda which China and ASEAN wants to agree upon. But my own proposition is, even setting up, the previous one, declaration on the conduct of parties in South China Sea, signed in 2002. It took nearly 20 years to sign it. And since then, of course, they tried to advance to the binding COC, but over the last 14 years, almost nothing. And finally, because ASEAN's unity has been questioned, taking a bit harsher action on South China Sea, China started, promising, okay, we try to accelerate the speed for the negotiation to sign, targeting 2017. But again, I'm quite skeptical on that, particularly given the history. And also binding. China's Navy is put on under the binding of the ASEAN. Again, this is very questionable too. Next one, again, I think time is limited. Let me quickly say the ASEAN Economic Community. So this is an agenda which also I try to use to push the idea that the ASEAN is in trouble. Again, 3 issues I highlighted. Number one, lower intra-regional trade shares. I went to the ADBI, it's statistics, looking at the last 5-6 years index. It's about 23-24%, which means about 80% of the trade of ASEAN are with non-ASEAN states. So ASEAN Economic Community, what does it mean for ASEAN member states who are always happy to have a trade investment with external countries? But when China, Japan, Korea joined, this ratio actually increased quite rapidly. It's doubled. It's nearly 50%, reaching quite similar level of the European Union, which is about 60%. So if you go to UK, you can see a number of the European products in your supermarkets. But how about the Singapore I'm currently living? ASEAN products? Not at all. Quite few Americans, Australians, even Japanese products. Well, of course, sometimes Malaysians and also Singaporeans, even myself, try to be happy to buy some Malaysian products because it's much cheaper. But this is very much different from the British supermarket situations. ASEAN divide, again, there are a number of ways of indicating the divisions or divides in ASEAN. Well, most, the striking example is economic development, which I tried to show you, right? So Singapore per capita, it's much higher than Japanese GDP per capita. It's nearly $60,000. But just look at Cambodia, Myanmar, just 1/80 or 90th. So how do such a big the economic development gap exists in the region? Economic community regional integration could be achieved. It's very difficult. So what ASEAN tried to do to promote integration, even under such circumstances, is so-called lowest common denominator approach, which means they try to adjust the speed or degree of regional integration to at least developed nations. And that's why Singapore is always looking at outside the region. Why Singapore started P4, which is the origins of TPP, early 2000, was of course to invite more external countries to create market for their exporting products. And Singapore's vision proved to be right. And the US started joining in 2008, followed by Australia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and of course Japan. And TPP signed February this year. But of course, ratification is in trouble. Some nations like here. But again, TPP is not a major issue here today. But the Japanese government now started thinking of this starting ratification process in diet session starting, I think, next week or 2 weeks' time. So that, the US could be finding to have a renegotiation, to make the agenda more favorable to certain American peoples. Well, Malaysia already did. So I think if US couldn't ratify it, well, that would be probably a big problem, not only for Japan, US, but also ASEAN as well. A reason, as I mentioned, some of the ASEAN nations find the TPP as a way for breaking so-called lowest common denominator issues. So this is, I think, the embodiment of the so-called ASEAN minus X approach. This is something which ASEAN tried to employ, but a lot of opposition from developing countries came. So Singapore couldn't do it. But now joining TPP, currently 4 member states of ASEAN are TPP signatories. Of course, they're quite happy if TPP ratified and became effective, so that the sort of the quite high quality of regional integration, which ASEAN cannot accomplish, is coming down to Southeast Asia. And as evidence, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines already showed an interest in their own participation in TPP. So TPP can be expanded. That would be quite significant for America's economic interest. But of course, it should be done. The ratification should be done before that. That is a necessary condition. Okay, time has come. Okay, conclusions. As I mentioned in the beginning, as a skeptics of ASEAN, particularly the recent examples of ASEAN Economic Community building and also South China Sea and ASEAN's approaches, it simply proved the sort of the ASEAN malfunction thesis. So how we can change it? Some ASEAN states started talking about the abandonment of consensus-based decision-making system, which ASEAN cherished over the last 4 or 5 decades. Again, it's quite interesting. It indicates the seriousness of the crisis some of the ASEAN member states have considered. And number 2, TPP. It's very different from ASEAN regional integration. For example, ASEAN Economic Community hardly touch on the services, investment, non-tariff barriers, all of which are included in TPP. So as I mentioned before, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, willingness to participate in it means they also need to follow up the sort of the regional integration which TPP try to promote. Can they do it? I think they can, as Vietnam demonstrated. Vietnamese economic reform has been quite rapidly progressing. And some of the key factories now shifting their bases from China so that they can export freely to a bigger market like United States or Japan, particularly textiles. And already China lost its comparative advantage in terms of prices. And that would be quite important. And of course, China has been a bit worried about a potential trade diversion caused by TPP. So I think 2 ways related to South China Sea and the ASEAN Economic Community, abandonment of the ASEAN-based ASEAN way, and also the inclusion introduction of TPP would be probably helping a change of the landscape of ASEAN and also the crisis mood most of us ASEAN nations currently having might be changed eventually. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We've asked Mark to really talk from a U.S. perspective, but I actually thought Takashi's, this particular slide was very interesting, and I was wondering if, in addition to whatever prepared comments you have, if you would like to say if you agree with Takashi's interpretation of ASEAN and its relations with the United States and China as well. So just to throw that at you.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Yes?
I agree. But I can go into more detail, sure.
Okay.
Thanks, Shihoko. In contrast to what you said, Shihoko, the timing of this talk actually for me is pretty lousy because I woke up early this morning to sort of refine, polish my remarks, and of course heard the news on NPR. They said the BBC is coming up to talk about the North Korean nuclear tests, and I thought, that was 9 months ago. And then, of course, found out more. So, so unfortunately, I will have to run right after, not my remarks, but after the event to deal with stuff because we're already getting lots of interest, as you can imagine, about this topic. First of all, thank you, Shihoko, and to the Wilson Center for hosting this event, and to you, Shihoko, for carrying the candle or the torch. That Wilson Center has a long tradition of doing terrific work on East Asia in general. Thanks also to USJI, which has been such a great addition to discussions of Japan in DC since they came on the scene in general, and thanks to your role in making that possible, Takashi. And it's great to be with you on a panel, again, as always. I should start off by saying a disclaimer, since I do work for a government agency, the U.S. Congressional Research Service. My remarks are my own. They don't in any way represent those of CRS. They also don't represent in any way 535 members of Congress or the thousands of staff who I work for. So I can't blame them. I can only blame myself for what I'm about to say. So I want to, I'm also, like Takashi, I'm going to sort of talk broadly in broad brushstrokes, and I think if you have more detailed questions, we can talk about those in the Q&A session. But I want to disagree with some of the premises that were in the write-up, which I know, Shihoko, you did to be deliberately provocative in part, but I'll take that as a point of departure. I think the write-up, and if you may want to take a look at it again, it paints the picture a little too starkly, at least for the situation when it comes to great power competition in Southeast Asia, as it is today. And it does this in two senses. First, while it's true that there is great power competition in Southeast Asia, I don't see yet that we haven't deteriorated to a Cold War type situation where there is a zero-sum situation between the great powers, and actually you could put this as between the US and Japan on one side and China on the other, on most issues. You can pick apart, you can identify some specific issues, particularly the South China Sea, where that is the case, although as I'll talk about in a little bit, I think there is areas for cooperation there. But in general, there's no overarching zero-sum situation, and that's especially true on economic matters, and I'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. And secondly, the write-up, I think, paints the picture too starkly in the sense that on even the most difficult security issues that the US and China are dealing with, there is ample scope for cooperation. You know, even on things like, especially North Korea, but even on things like Taiwan or the South China Sea. The key question is whether both sides, the US and China, are willing to take the steps that would accommodate each other's interests enough that both sides could save face to back away from the situation. On the South China Sea, I'm not sure we're there yet, although there are ways that we could do that. As I said, great power competition has returned to Southeast Asia in a way that we haven't really seen in a generation since the 70s and early 80s. We've seen a more assertive China since the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. The U.S. has become much more involved in Southeast Asia. You could point to the date of 2010, as Takashi said, with Secretary Clinton's intervention that year, that summer, in the ASEAN Regional Forum Foreign Ministers meeting, where she asserted that the U.S. had a vital interest in what was going on in the South China Sea and pushing back against China. And since roughly 2011, 2012, we've also seen a return of Japan as a major player in Southeast Asia. Now, of course, Japan has always been a significant, or has long been a significant, economic player. But what's new and different is that Japan has returned not only as a diplomatic actor, in a way that we haven't seen probably since the 80s, 70s, and 80s. But what's truly new is that Japanese security diplomacy also has come into play, and you have seen this most recently with some security agreements that Prime Minister Abe and Malaysia have signed. So I'll talk first about security issues and then about economic issues. On security issues, this intensified great power competition is both constraining and enabling. So it's both has limiting effects and also has expanded what middle powers and smaller countries can do. On the one hand, some of the constraining factors. It clearly has made forging an independent line on major security issues more difficult. You see this also in Northeast Asia, where South Korea, under President Park Geun-hye, has been trying to pursue some independent initiatives. And whereas 4 or 5 years ago, there was much more room for South Korean action, the intensification of the rivalry between U.S. and China has made that much more difficult, as well as the rivalry between Japan and China. You see this also in Southeast Asia as well. As Takashi has said, ASEAN unity has become much more difficult on key security issues that involve the U.S. and China. The South China Sea is a perfect example of that, and that's where this chart plays in, because you have a China versus the U.S., Japan, Philippines, and Vietnam dynamic really playing out. ASEAN's consensus-based decision-making process has made it quite easy for China to peel off, even just 1 or 2 players like Cambodia and Laos, to block ASEAN as a whole from taking more concerted action. One interesting factor I think to look forward to, and maybe Marvin, you may go into this, I don't know, it's certainly a question I would have for you, is to what extent are ASEAN players going to go look outside the ASEAN process? They won't be abandoning ASEAN, but they'll look for an ASEAN plus formula in a way that kind of you were talking about, Takashi, but do it in a much more forceful way. And I think certainly this is something that the U.S. and Japan, while they're not trying to break up ASEAN or split ASEAN, they are clearly trying to make it more possible or easier for ad hoc cooperation on issues like maritime security for players like Vietnam, Philippines, and now in Malaysia and Indonesia to play a more concerted coordinating role in coordinating and collaborating with each other so that there can be a more concerted response to Chinese actions and maybe even taking some proactive measures as well. On the other side, competition between the great powers can also, in some ways, expand options for middle powers. I look, for example, at Vietnam. Vietnam has dramatically expanded its outreach to the United States. Why has it done this? It's because it's looking for greater options with China. Arguably, the dramatic acceleration of the pace of U.S.-Vietnam relations would not have happened without greater power cooperation. And this applies not just to security issues, but also to a whole range of issues. And again, in the U.S.-Vietnam context, you've seen agreements signed on civilian nuclear cooperation. The Peace Corps are going back to Vietnam for the first time in a generation. So it just increases the scope of action across the board on so many different areas, not just on security issues. Great power competition has made Southeast Asia a greater priority for the United States. So I think it's no coincidence, or it's not an accident, that the President of the United States is in Laos now. He's the first president to visit Laos. Again, that may not happen without greater Sino-U.S. competition in Southeast Asia. Greater competition has also given Japan an opportunity to increase its security-related diplomacy in Southeast Asia. And in contrast to what Takashi said, I think there is, while I take what you say about ASEAN's weakness, but I don't know if, but I think it's going too far to imply that ASEAN is becoming irrelevant, which I may be stretching what you were saying, but I think at least for now, that increased great power competition has made ASEAN and ASEAN centrality even more relevant. And the fact that you have these diplomatic battles going on at the East Asia Summit and at various fora, where the U.S. and other countries are trying to put the South China Sea on the agenda, and China is trying, and its like-minded countries, Cambodia and Laos, are trying to resist that. That just highlights the fact that ASEAN has actually become, in some ways, more relevant than less. And I could say more if you have questions and answers to that. Now, this moment could pass. I think that's clear. But at least for now, and certainly for the last 5-6 years, I think that has been the case, basically since the U.S. has re-entered the fold since 2010. Let me turn to economic matters. Here, I think there is a lot of room for overlap between the systems that the U.S. and China are promoting. Yes, clearly there's competition. China on the one hand, the U.S., Japan on the other hand, are both trying to promote their own visions of a new regional economic order in Asia. In some ways, you could cast this as TPP versus One Belt, One Road and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And there are plenty of Americans, and especially many Japanese, who have concerns about China's initiatives that OBOR, One Belt, One Road, is going to strengthen China and then give it more options in the security field. And maybe even more fundamentally, a concern that China-backed initiatives are much less open and transparent to many people than U.S.-preferred and Japanese-preferred arrangements. And Xi Jinping, highlighted this last year at the APEC summit when he talked about fragmentation that was occurring because of the various regional free trade works that were cropping up, and this was seen by many people as an attack on TPP. However, this, even less so than in the security field, or much less so, this is not a zero-sum game. You see a lot of competitive liberalization going on. So when progress is made in TPP, that will often spur the participants in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, which does not include the United States, but does include China. Advancements in TPP will put pressure on the RCEP countries to undertake more liberalization there. So you have a real again, competitive liberalization. You have a real competitive dynamic that in some ways is quite healthy. Likewise, as Takashi said, having TPP, rather than seeing it as splitting ASEAN, I think it gives ASEAN countries more options. Going back to what I said before, it's quite useful for the Singapores, the Malaysias to look for a higher standard FTA than say the ASEAN Economic Community, for example, or than RCEP. And going even beyond that, as some people would say, TPP can help shape individual countries' internal and external decisions that they're making. So, for example, there are many people and many economic reformers in Vietnam who see TPP as what's necessary to break the internal political logjams that they have come up against. Because they can promote this as not only as an economic tool, but a security argument. We need to better integrate with the United States and Japan, et cetera, and they can use that in their domestic battles to promote economic reforms, market-oriented economic reforms that they otherwise would have more difficulty doing. You could see that same dynamic, in theory, coming into play with China down the road. If it decides to join TPP, if we do have a TPP, indeed. Likewise, when we look at China's economic initiatives, you don't see the U.S. and Japan trying to block them, at least not to my mind. I could be corrected in that. 7 out of the 12 TPP members are in RCEP, which is often portrayed in the press as a China-led negotiation. On One Belt, One Road, as I mentioned before, there's plenty of ambivalence, some might say even skepticism in the United States and Japan, but not outright opposition, because outright opposition would essentially mean containment. And I don't think you have any policymakers realistically talking about, let alone enacting, economic containment of China. Even with the AIIB, where there's a lot of evidence that the United States was actively trying to prevent or discourage, some might say even pressure its allies not to join the AIIB. Last year, the U.S. seems to have come around now that it's become a fait accompli, and once various allies joined. There's lots of evidence that the U.S., particularly through the World Bank, is working closely with the AIIB rather than against it. So again, lots of room for cooperation and overlap here. I think the thing that at least that I'm focusing on in the economic sphere is the extent to which China is going to use economic tools to promote its diplomatic ends, sort of in a punitive way. So, for example, China is very upset with South Korea for deploying the THAAD, which is a form of missile defense, and there are all sorts of rumors that China is going to cut off or find ways to curtail South Korean exports of, for example, soap operas and other digital media. China has shown its willingness to do this in the past. When there was a flare-up in 2012 between China and Japan over the Senkakus, all of a sudden rare earth metals weren't making their way to the Japanese market anymore. That would be something I think that would raise the stakes in the economics sphere and could provoke a greater form of competition that we haven't seen to date, and we have seen in the security field, and that could ramp things up. But let's wait and see. We've seen this a bit here and there. If China makes that a more systematic policy, that's something that we'll have to worry about. I could go on, but I think probably I'm out of time, right? Okay, so I'll pass the torch then.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. We're talking about ASEAN, but like any good discussion on ASEAN, we always end up talking a lot about China's foreign policy. So we are going to turn to Professor Aoyama for her perspective on the issue. Let me go back.
Okay, thank you, Shihoko. And it's my great pleasure to be here to share my view with you. Today, I'm going to be talking about China's foreign policy towards Southeast Asia. The relations between China and ASEAN countries are asymmetric, and China is a giant, much bigger, much larger than ASEAN members alone or altogether. But while China's rise in Asia is a relatively new phenomenon. Oh, mic. Okay. Doesn't work. Okay, thanks. Okay, China, from the end of Cold War, China shifted toward placing importance on its surrounding countries. Well, in terms of China's Asia policy, China started from improve its relations with its surrounding countries. So Mongolia, Indonesia, Singapore, Brunei, Vietnam, South Korea in the early 1990s. And China also demarcated its border among Shanghai Five members throughout 1990s and with Vietnam in 1999 and to the year of 2000. Okay, it works. And China launched full-scale diplomacy efforts in Asia in the late 1990s. Well, along with this effort made in Central Asia, Northeast Asia, and South Asia, China has actively engaged with ASEAN nations on multiple fronts. Oh, sorry. So generally speaking, during this period of time, by adopting a good neighbor policy, China's presence in Asia has expanded rapidly. So China's ascent in Asia can be attributed to several factors. First, the principle of shelving maritime disputes in China's foreign policy has enabled regional cooperation. And second, China has successfully driven economic regionalism across East Asia, promoting the economic integration and FTAs with countries in Asia has been the top priority in China's foreign policy. ACFTA, ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement, was first proposed by China by Premier Zhu Rongji in the year of 2000. And ACFTA came into effect in 2010. China also concluded the FTA with Singapore in 2008. So now, China is among the top 3 trading partners for every ASEAN country. Third, the China burgeoning multilateralism in China's foreign behavior. China has strengthened its economic ties by actively engaging with both regional and sub-regional institutions. As a result, a diversified and multi-level cooperation pattern was set up between China and the ASEAN countries. And fourth, in the security realm, the new security concept, by emphasizing cooperation in the non-traditional security arena, has facilitated China's military cooperation and action in Asia, especially under the framework of Great Mekong sub-region development programs. China has worked closely with Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia in coping with problems such as transnational drug trafficking, smuggling, and human trafficking. As Takashi and Mark mentioned before, that, like Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia are the countries who are now supporting, backing China's stance in terms of South China Sea. So one of the reasons that these countries are now supporting China, is because there's the cooperative framework such as, well, Great Mekong Sub-Region Development Programs. Well, and under these programs, China worked closely with these countries. But as we all know, in the last decade, well, with a more assertive China's foreign policy, the relationship between China and ASEAN nations has been strained. Moreover, the United States' pivot to Asia has changed the diplomatic, political, and security landscape of Asia-Pacific region. But in general, the ASEAN members has welcomed a more strong presence of the United States and sought to deepen their ties with the United States as a counterweight to the rising China influence. So now, let's look at China's response to the US pivot to Asia. China's reaction to the US pivot to Asia has been complex. The Chinese government singled out OBOR as the most important feature of Xi Jinping's foreign policy. So first of all, what is OBOR? Well, OBOR, which is also known as One Belt, One Road Initiative, refers to two separate but interrelated policies. The Silk Road Economic Belt and 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. As you can see from this map, I'm sorry, it's too small. Maybe it's hard to see. Well, the Silk Road Economic Belt starts from Xi'an, the Asian capital where the historical Silk Road began, and connects China with Venice across Central Asia. The 21st century also starts from China and ends with Venice. It includes ports in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Kenya, Italy, across the Indian Ocean, and through the Red Sea. So it will connect China with Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, and Europe. So OBOR was first mentioned by Xi Jinping in 2013, and in November 2014, China announced the creation of the new Silk Road Fund. In May last year, specific policies pertaining to the OBOR were relieved. So according to these policies, China will create 6 transnational China-centric economic corridors with an estimated total investment of $819 billion, or probably maybe more. The OBOR usually regarded as China's pivot to Eurasia policy, but maybe that is not the case. Well, so far 2 maps have been relieved by the Chinese government. The colored one was first released in autumn 2013, and this one is widely distributed in media. The black, actually, but in fact, the Chinese government released a new map last year. The black and white one, I'm sorry, it's in Japanese. And can you tell the difference between the 2 maps? Well, as you can see from this map, there's a new route that was added to the old version. The route links China with Pacific Islands. So simply from these 2 maps, we can easily understand that OBOR is not limited to Eurasia. It is a global strategy of China's foreign policy. But on the other hand, OBOR as a global strategy of China's foreign policy is China's response to the US pivot to Asia. Well, China intends to connect itself with over 60 nations through 五通, 5 connectivities. So that is to say, by OBOR, China seeks to deepen its political, infrastructure, economic, institutional, and cultural ties with key parts of the globe. But it is also important to note that OBOR is also part of China's military strategy. In December 2008, Chinese naval battleship was deployed off the coast of Somalia in order to conduct anti-piracy operations. And now China is building its first military outpost in Djibouti. So China by OBOR, China is also trying to deepen its military ties with other countries. But so now, what is the role of OBOR? As we can see in OBOR, what is the role of ASEAN and ASEAN countries in OBOR? So as we can see in OBOR initiative, ASEAN members and ASEAN as a regional institution present strategic importance to China. That is why, since China put forward OBOR initiative, China has revisited its foreign policy towards Southeast Asian countries, seeking to upgrade its ties with ASEAN members in terms of specific policies to mitigate the negative impact of TPP. China is now trying to promote FTAs with countries in Asia, and also China is trying to promote RCEP, FTAP. And China has also sought to revitalize its sub-regional cooperation. In March this year, Lancang Mekong Summit was convened in Sanya, a city in South China. And this new Great Mekong Sub-Regional Economic Cooperation Project is regarded as the early stage harvest of the OBOR initiative. So under this framework, China will work closely with Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and probably Vietnam. So this kind of project has the possibility to further divide ASEAN in the near future. And as I mentioned before, OBOR is of military importance too. And as China is now trying to build ports in the Southeast countries, such as Cambodia and Myanmar. Of course, such projects are for commercial purpose, but they can also be useful for creating networks to support supply, maintenance, repair for long-distance naval missions. So to sum up, since the end of Cold War, when the United States, Japan, and other countries adopted an engagement policy toward China, but in the meantime, China itself has adopted an engagement policy towards Asian countries. And China's engagement policy has deepened strategic relations with the ASEAN members. As a result, well, ASEAN states are divided as they confront a rising China, and ASEAN is losing its centrality. And after launching the OBOR initiative, China re-emphasized the importance of China-ASEAN relations, and now is seeking to create an overlapping and multi-layered regional economic integrations in Asia by promoting FTAs, RCEP, and FTAP. And my last point is that, well, China's current foreign policy is based on assumption that even if China make no compromise in terms of maritime issues, China can still deepen its economic and political ties with ASEAN members. But unfortunately, maybe this profound strategic misperception and contradiction within China's foreign policy will inevitably undermine China's influence in Asia. I stop here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive analysis. We've saved Marvin for last because I'm hoping he'll be able to put everything together and focus on an ASEAN perspective as well.
Thank you, Shihoko-san. There's one immutable law of panels, and that is that the person who comes up last will be out of time. There's a lot of experience and expertise in this room, so I would think there would be a premium on having some chance for discussion in the room and comment and questions. With that in mind, I'm going to sort of throw away the script and try to sort of truncate or summarize my remarks down to 2 or 3 minutes. You've just heard a very sophisticated laydown of China's policy towards this region from Professor Aoyama, and I won't try to reiterate any of that, but let me try to make a couple simple points, and just as a provocative start, in the very helpful sort of debate that Mark set up with Shihoko over the way the issue is framed in your presentation paper for this event. I'll come down on Shihoko's side on this. I do that as someone who comes out of a security strategy background, longtime CIA, Defense, Senate Intelligence Committee, National War College, and viewed through that lens. I will argue, have argued for a long time, that the emerging competition in Southeast Asia is more than in the South China Sea and the Western Pacific, the maritime regions, is more than a competition. It's becoming a very serious geopolitical rivalry, and it has the real potential for becoming a military conflict in some form. That is not to gainsay the possibilities of multiple forms of cooperation on the economic side. And it's also not to argue that there isn't the potential for compromise. On the security side, the problem is for those of us looking for a compromise, and all of us at this table could sort of detail what that compromise might look like. I keep looking for some sign, any sign, that China has any inclination to seek a compromise, to find some kind of modified, less than our way or the highway position, and I haven't seen it. And every day that goes by seems to make that prospect of a compromise outcome less likely due to Beijing's very hard-edged geopolitical ambitions, which have translated into territorial expansion into the maritime space. Okay, with that, just 2 or 3 minutes worth. What strikes me on this subject, first of all, is to say about ASEAN. ASEAN was formed in 1967. It was formed, think back what 1967 was like. This is the period of the most intense phase of the Vietnam War. It's against the backdrop of communist insurgencies throughout the region, threatening the survival of governments throughout the region. It was a very wrapped in fire sort of period for the Southeast Asian governments, and there was a very strong sense among them, the old adage, we either hang together or we hang separately. We'd better figure out ways to collaborate with one another to present a common diplomatic face to the world, to reduce our vulnerability to external manipulation, to search for ways that we can strengthen some kind of economic cooperation among us to build, and the favorite term of the day was resilience in the region, to make the region less susceptible to subversion, to penetration, to manipulation. And that set of ambitions dovetailed very nicely with the position and the strategic interests of both the United States and Japan in the post-Vietnam War era period. And we entered what I'll call a sort of the halcyon days of Southeast Asia's relationship with both within the region, but with Japan, with China, with the United States. This was a time when Vietnam's war is over, the Vietnamese forces have withdrawn from Cambodia, there are no serious interstate conflicts in the region. All the countries in the region are devoted to economic development as an overriding objective. Many of them are being very successful, think Singapore, Malaysia, and so on. The U.S. was offering both a security blanket for the region and a market to absorb product. Japan was offering a market, but more particularly both investment and ODA. And China was offering a benign face to the region. This is Deng Xiaoping, this is post-Mao, this is China embracing economic development as an objective, and the message from Beijing was, we all are trying to accomplish the same thing. There are lots of synergies to be had. We can all get rich together. Life is good, and it was. And that period, that sort of halcyon period, continued until fairly recently. When it began to become evident that China, in fact, had other ambitions related to territory, security, the maritime space. And the pressure that China has put on the region through its territorial expansion into the South China Sea is something we can go into in more detail, but suffice it to say that it presented ASEAN with a dilemma, or the ASEAN countries with a dilemma, in terms of how to respond. And there are, in my sort of typology, there were four broad choices that these countries had before them. One was to forge greater unity and sort of double down on ASEAN cohesion and unity and common purpose and common position among them, to, back to sort of the original ASEAN vision. That was one option. A second was the opposite, fragmentation and paralysis under Chinese pressure, countries going their own way, many of them basically folding in the face of overriding Chinese power. Third, a search for external support to buttress some kind of security strategy vis-a-vis China that could not be maintained with resources within the region. And finally, simply accommodation and surrender to Chinese ambitions. And I would argue, we can go into the details, that what you see, first of all, on the first point is ASEAN has not been able to forge a kind of common security response. And it goes into the reasons that have already been enumerated in terms of consensus and the rest of it. In that sense, ASEAN has revealed itself, and it's long been evident, I'll use the metaphor, as a fair weather organization. It's not adapted to stormy seas. In terms of the fragmentation, the search for external support, accommodation, and so on, you see the whole range of responses in the region, right from Vietnam on one pole to Cambodia on the other. And for the U.S., the Chinese ambitions, geopolitical, territorial, have presented also a choice. It was entirely possible, from a theoretical standpoint at least, if I want to play sort of geopolitical analysis, for the U.S. to have accommodated to China's ambitions. And I think that's exactly what President Xi had in mind when he talked about the new era in great power relations in the first Sunnylands meeting with President Obama, that the U.S. would be wise enough to do what former great powers who had been on top and were now in descent and were now passing from the scene. The U.S. would be wise enough to recognize the historical trends and accommodate to China's rise and take a back seat to China, particularly in East Asia, and in that way harmony would be preserved. And that was a strategic option available. The Obama administration chose not to take it. It's not in the American DNA, and so we've had to pivot. And that was a fateful choice. That meant that the United States has declared it will, in fact, try to stand in the way of China's geopolitical ambitions in the Western Pacific. And I would argue, and this is be a long discussion, that the U.S. strategy is at this point incomplete on the military side and deeply uncertain on the economic side, with the fate of TPP being hanging by a thread, if that. Japan has gone through an evolution of its own. Japan's role was almost entirely economic in this Halcyon period that I talked about earlier. It was important for Southeast Asia in that regard as an engine of economic development. But if you, I did a series of interviews in Tokyo in the mid-2000 first decade, looking for attitudes towards China. And what I was getting was a lot of hand-wringing in the Gaima-sho and the self-defense forces and so on about the implications of what they saw as China's growing geopolitical ambition. But the interview would always conclude with, "We hope you Americans will do something about it." Well, we've gone past that now. The Abe regime is clearly determined to try to do something itself about that. So we've had the assistance to various Southeast Asian countries, patrol boats and that sort of thing. And all of that dovetails very closely with the U.S. pivot. I would argue that there's a kind of a good, in effect, working strategic partnership underway. And for the Southeast Asian countries to conclude, this provides them at least with options. And if all of the Southeast Asian countries, with perhaps the exception of Cambodia, maybe Laos, are adopting hedging strategies of some sort, with some sort of blend between accommodation and trying to shore up resistance, a hedge won't work unless you've got some support you can turn to strengthen your strategic position, your security position, and both the U.S. and Japan, in effect jointly, are trying to provide that.
Great, thank you. And thank you for keeping your comments relatively short. We have very little time, but there is a microphone. What I would like to do is ask those of you who may have questions to raise their hands, and I'll take a few together in the interest of time. But I don't see any hands. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, Phil Schrafer. I wonder, we see China as sort of a monolithic power. I wonder if the model might be more accurate like the Iran model, where you have Khomeini not being a spiritual leader as much as a Machiavellian who keeps a balance between the right and the left. Isn't China responding possibly with at least two factions? One that sees humiliation, still resents World War II and so on, and is trying to regain military dominance and so on, and another faction wants global economy to succeed.
Okay. Before someone else answers that, I saw a couple of other hands. Are there any more questions? No. Yes.
Yeah, Dave.
Can you wait for the microphone? I'm sorry.
Dave Fitzgerald, retired State Department. A couple of questions about the U.S.-Japan response now, which seems to be a little bit more robust. There's been a lot of talk about whether Japan or even South Korea should participate more in freedom of navigation exercises in Southeast Asia. Is that a step too far for Japan, maybe for the Japanese or others want to? And is that something that the U.S. really wants to encourage? Mr. Roth seemed to talk in terms of like we had a chance at the Sunnyland Summit and we've sort of taken a route in another direction. There's probably another way back from that. So I don't think it's quite as drastic as it might seem. But the Japanese role, it seemed to me, was going to be very limited in what they can do in Southeast Asia, and maybe our own role will be that too.
Okay. Thank you.
Like to comment on
Why don't we do this? Why don't I ask each speaker in the order that they presented to address one or both of the questions? So we start with you, Takashi.
Okay. Again, I'm not American citizen or government person, so I have no qualified with America, wants Japan to be, engaged in freedom of navigation activities. But what I heard while I was in Japan was that there were two different views on the Japanese commitment to the freedom of navigation activities. But Gaimsho, Minister of Foreign Affairs, tended to support, tended to be more enthusiastic about, the engagement, while Defense Ministry was not. The reason I heard was, of course, Defense Ministry tended to be quite cautious about the potential casualties. Of course, that might invite China's, more actions, as already did recently. The Chinese ships came into the, some of the Japanese territories around the Senkaku Islands. And Prime Minister Abe, Japanese government expected China to be very quiet before the G20 meetings, but not. So, some of the reasons why didn't China continue to be so much, active in terms of putting pressure on Japan by, sending ships, some of them actually public ships, to the Senkaku Islands was, of course, the China's dissatisfaction with the Japanese continuous engagement in South China Sea through the expression, not the sort of actions by the Japanese leaders, particularly Prime Minister. So again, some people are quite willing to push forward the Japanese engagement, but I want to say there is some cautious views as well within the Japanese communities. So as far as these the divisions among the Japanese engagement in South China Sea exist, of course we need some sort of external pressure or guidance from the United States to solve this the division problem in terms of the participation in navigation. Another point, Filipino president, previous one, Noinoe Aquino, who came to Japan last year to give a speech in the Japanese Diet, suggesting the Japanese government or Prime Minister Abe to use the military bases of Philippines to embody the Japanese engagement in South China Sea. That would be, as far as I know, not necessarily seriously considered in Japanese community, mainly because, of course, president was changed. But, again, that created some of the debate within Japan. Because without using some Southeast Asian bases, Japanese the airplane couldn't actually patrol the South China Seas. Mainly they are flying from Okinawa, taking 3-4 hours, and how many hours they have left, including the returning time. So it's very limited. So it's more technological problems in terms of Japanese engagement. But one solution, of course, to solve this problem was to allow Japanese self-defense force come to Southeast Asia. But of course, this is obviously unconstitutional. We cannot do it. So again, engagement within freedom of navigation is an interesting idea, particularly in terms of strengthening U.S.-Japan relationships. But as you suggested, we need strong America's, the request. Otherwise, this sort of the debate on constitutional, unconstitutional, or even the antagonizing Chinese and etc. This kind of views obviously would emerge in Japan. So it's more social problems, I guess. Thank you.
Thanks. Mark?
Sure. On the U.S.-Japan, sort of coordinated response, in terms of the freedom of navigation exercise, either Japan doing it alone or U.S. and Japan doing it, I think there are not only, there are obviously questions in Japan, but I think my sense is there's some hesitancy in the United States, whether that is a bridge too far. Because after all, what's the likely impact? Okay, yes, you demonstrate the point, but we arguably have demonstrated it, arguably maybe perhaps not enough with our current exercises, but again, that's another debate. But it hasn't had the desired impact yet, and if it were done publicly, as Tarada Sensei implied, it could just make it even more likely that China will respond accordingly. Now, there may be lots of things quietly that can be done, and this is part of the dance, the difficult dance. How do you quiet actions that can be taken, that can be sent, that can send a message to China that A, that the U.S. and Japan are more willing to take action together, and B, that they have the capabilities across the board to do so. And to send that message might be a more effective way to do it. Now, of course, the problem is then doing that quietly. It's hard then to answer some of the political voices in both countries who are calling for more action, and not to mention some of the people who are watching in various Southeast Asian countries as well who want more reassurance. So that's part of the art of this. I'd be curious as to what Marvin thinks about this issue as well. Just real quickly on the China front, and I'll defer to Aoyama Sensei on this. But I often, on many of these cases, I think that domestic politics provide a lot of the answer. We often assume that it's foreign policy thing, but quite often there's a domestic political angle that when push comes to shove is really what's going on here. The fact that we have a party Congress coming up next year in China, I think that's got to loom quite large in Xi Jinping's calculations right now.
Okay, in terms of Japan's conduction of freedom of navigation activities in South China Sea, well, I study China's foreign policy, so if we look at from the perspective of China's foreign policy, the Japan's involvement in the freedom of navigation activities may well strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance in sending a strong message to China, but there has may trigger some negative impact too. First, maybe China will try to, push China to align further with with Russia. Because, when we talk about South China Sea, usually we will see it as the competition between China and the United States. But Russia is also a global power, and now we can see some, signals, we can see some signs that China and Russia are aligning in terms of South China Sea. But so the Japan's conduction of freedom of navigation activities may push China further toward Russia. And that's the scenario that we don't want to see. And it might also trigger more aggressive China's action in South China Sea too.
Just real quick on the question of Japanese patrols in the South China Sea. I've talked with colleagues who have sort of track two kind of activities, who have gone to Tokyo, met with senior Japanese officials, and raised that question: would Japan consider? And the answer was, as I understand it, emphatically no. It's just not in the cards. On the question of factions within the Chinese government, I'm not a sinologist. Professor Aoyama can probably speak to this better than I can, but I'll make a provocative sort of response. Of course, there are factions within the Chinese government. This is a huge, complex operation for representing a huge, complex country, multiple factions without question. The question is which of these factions actually affect or count when it comes to strategic decisions. And I think there has been, provocative comment, a lot of wishful thinking within the sinology community in this country over recent years that there is this sort of dovish faction, foreign ministry, academics, very people trained in the United States, that represented a voice for compromise within the halls of power in Beijing. And there's no question that within the foreign ministry, within the academic community and so on in China, those people do exist. The problem is there's no evidence they have any influence at all at the top levels of decision making. And there it's the party, it's Xi Jinping personally, and it's the PLA. And these folks are not interested, as near as I can read it, in any kind of compromise. And Xi Jinping has enforced an increasingly unified, centralized decision-making process, created his own National Security Council, multiplied his own sort of positions and roles. So we now have the strongest, most centralized regime in China since Mao Zedong at his height. And that, you know, the room for the voices of accommodation in China, as near as I can tell, are essentially cut off.
Right. Well, I'm afraid we've actually gone slightly over time, but thank you all so much for staying with us until the end. And if you could join me to thank our speakers today for a really great discussion on a very timely topic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much again, and we hope to see you again soon.
Southeast Asia.